I'm going to speak really from my current location, which is as the Executive Secretary of the International Union of Spears General. But I'm hoping you'll be able to apply some of what I'm saying to your various contexts. And the title given me was Women Religious Planning for the Future, a story of surprising consolation. And I think you'll begin to see how some of this consolation emerged as we religious women. There are about 650,000 sisters worldwide. I think 12% of the religious women of the world live in India, so they're very well represented. And also, obviously, we're at a maximum time of change in religious life. So I've named some of the challenges that we've been facing in religious life. Numbers declining in congregations, numbers of congregations declining as congregations fuse and merge, also as congregations come to completion. One of my roles is in helping some of those congregations come to completion. And it's often done with great dignity and great joy. It doesn't have to be a time of sadness. Obviously, the average age of sisters is increasing, and many congregations worldwide are letting go of what might be called corporate ministries, schools, hospitals, big institutions, and are moving into new ministries. And like other parts of the church, religious women have faced criticism in terms of institutional failure with regard to abuse. That generally happened in orphanages, mother and baby homes, or in sometimes reformatories or institutions that were often run on behalf of the church or on behalf of the state. And I think we've learned a lot in terms of that. And I think, one of my learnings very early on at UISG, we actually did a survey with the Dicastery for Religious Life, because we were preparing for a new version of Mutuae Relationes, the relationship between bishops and religious. And a survey was sent out worldwide. And a lot of the sisters who responded said they felt voiceless and faceless in the church and in the world. In other words, they were working away, doing the work that they love to do, and serving the mission of the church and serving the people, but they felt they had little voice or visibility, very little engagement, sometimes with the local church, almost sometimes feeling like one was in a parallel stream. So they were some of the, if you like, the factors that have been emerging. And I think what I've noticed, and we have named for ourselves, is that we're living a phase of vulnerability.
Well,
and I think claiming vulnerability was a huge catalyst for change and transformation. And it's Brené Brown says, vulnerability is an emotion we experience in times of uncertainty, risk, and emotional exposure. But she also says vulnerability invites having the courage to show up when we can't control the outcome. So there's a sense in which that very feeling of vulnerability brought religious women in the global north and in the global south together. I saw a big change at our assemblies, which are held every 3 years. In 2016, there was really a strong owning of vulnerability. And when the sisters in the global north owned their vulnerability, the sisters in the global south were able to share their vulnerabilities. Because I think there may have been a feeling of that one section of the world, everything was fine, and the other section of the world was struggling. This really brought us into a shared, in a sense, common challenge. And I'm looking there at Pope Francis's quotes. We are the heirs of those who went before us and had the courage to dream. And I think the dreamers of our congregations lived through vulnerability and change. And Belden Lane, who writes so beautifully, said, the starting point for many things is grief at the very place when ending seems so absolute. So I think in many of our ministries, our locations, there are moments of letting go. Even in places where we may seem to be growing, when we make different apostolic choices, we're invited also to let go and to surrender. So we've focused quite a lot on vulnerability as religious sisters and as leaders of female congregations. And these are some of the challenges that Cardinal Tagley put to us. He said, why do you turn away from the physical, emotional, psychological scars that are part of our human condition? Have we been scarred by the culture of perfection? Do we allow ourselves to acknowledge our vulnerability? Do we allow others to express their vulnerability? And he saw this at both the personal level and the communal level. You know, when we're sharing and having those conversations in the Spirit, at the Synod, I was very struck when we moved into a space where we were able to share vulnerability. Something very special happened. There's a kind of coming together as community in a new way. There's a communion. So this is some of what we've been reflecting on. Brené Brown says you can't get to courage without rumbling with vulnerability. You know, in the sense there's an invitation to when we're trying to see where is that the magus, the more to which we're called. Somehow there's the challenge to really grapple with our own vulnerability and institutional vulnerability. I'm a fan of Leonard Cohen for the Canadians. And I love Ring the Bells That Still Can Ring, Forget Your Perfect Offering. There's a crack in everything. That's where the light gets in. And I think it's in the cracks, in our personal cracks, and also in our institutional failures and cracks that we have learnings to be done. So one of my invitations is often, have we the courage to name the scars and to name the cracks when we're engaged in any kind of apostolic planning? And when we're engaged in our own journey of change and conversion. And it's not easy to do, but I think it's something we need to do. It's easy to celebrate. It's easier to celebrate failure, to celebrate success. It's harder to name failure. In my own life's journey, I know I've learned much more by the failures than by the successes, when I've had the courage to enter into those failures. So with the Superiors General, we've done a lot of reflection on the spirituality of vulnerability. So it's one of the things I might add, like when we were doing the theological reflection that Christine's book really names as so important, you know, can we look at vulnerability? And I did this for myself. I named all the times that I could find where St. Paul names some sort of vulnerability. So you have it there, my friends, in Corinth, our hearts are wide open to you, and we speak freely, holding nothing back from you. So there's the kind of personal vulnerability. I share who I am. I come to you in weakness and fear and with much trembling. I'm the least of all the apostles. And then I have laboured and toiled and gone without sleep. I have known hunger and thirst, and have gone often without food. I've been cold and naked. If I boast, I will boast of the things that show my weaknesses. I delight in weakness, in insults, in hardship, in persecution, in difficulties, for when I am weak, then I am strong. My grace is sufficient for you, for power is made perfect in weakness. So as leaders of congregations, we've invited who really are, they lead the apostolic planning and direction of congregations. Can we enter into that space of need and weakness? So just before I go to the next section, just is there anything you'd like to add to those opening few words? Embracing our scars, owning our weakness and vulnerability. Does it ring true? Have you done it?
I think that question goes to something that was asked this morning in Yolanda of Yolanda, when she talked about women religious being able to talk to one another in ways that men religious can't or don't.
Yeah.
And I think part of the challenge is recognizing that it would be better to talk about these things before we're in kind of crisis mode.
Yeah.
And that, I think, is the challenge that I experience or understand.
Sure.
In the world that I live in.
Yeah. Yeah. It's not easy.
No.
And it's not always easy among women either. You know, I think we can presume it's easier than it really is. You know, I think the roles, maybe the jobs, the positions, just the tasks to be done can prevent us from spending the time that's needed to share at a more personal level, particularly when we can share vulnerability. Yeah. And yet I think, you know, it was interesting last week, the male and female religious met at Sacrofano. There were 250. There were 4 women, 4 men at each table. And they just said the sharing was very profound. So I think also there's an invitation to us as men and women, as cleric and lay, to really begin this kind of process of sharing at a deeper level. And that something breaks open both at the personal level and at the group and communal level when we can do that. So maybe I'll just move on to the second bit. The challenge for me in my own personal leadership was to develop and look at new models of thinking and relating. And there's one writer who I actually studied, did a doctorate in practical theology at Catholic Theological Union in Chicago. And when I was there, I was actually preparing to take up the role of executive director for the project in South Sudan. So I was reading anything I could and reflecting on peace building and modes of working at the grassroots level in a post-conflict situation. And I came across the writer John Paul Lederach, and I'll speak to you about him in a moment. But just I want to give you the kind of scope of what we're trying to do at UISG. We have 1,910 female superiors general who belong to the organisation. They gather in constellations or groups, and they meet in that group at least once a year, but they communicate in other ways. So there are 10 constellations in the Americas, 8 in Europe, 10 in Africa, 5 in Asia, 1 in the Middle East, 2 in Oceania, and you can see 2 in a kind of square box that are being developed, one in Vietnam, where there are thousands of women religious, and the other in Indonesia. So they're emerging constellations. So we're trying to reach that number and to plan with that number when we do strategic planning and apostolic planning, because we're planning for religious life in the world. We're saying, how can we as women religious make a difference, no matter where we are or with whom we're working? what are our, if you like, universal apostolic priorities when we're working. So I met John Paul Lederach, who teaches in Notre Dame. He's in the Croc School. And I learned, he comes from another discipline in a sense from where I was working. But I was very struck by these 4 concepts, which I offer you as you engage in apostolic planning too. The concept of moral imagination, web watching and web weaving, yeast and platforms. And the book that really, in a way, has influenced my own pastoral praxis has been his book called Moral Imagination, The Art and Soul of Peace Building. The art and soul of building peace. Right. So for Lederach, he saw moral imagination as the capacity to imagine something rooted in the challenge of the real world, yet capable of giving birth to something which does not yet exist. When I came to UASG, not much existed. It was a small organisation that did certain things very well. It held an assembly every 3 years. It produced a bulletin in 7 languages 3 times a year. And it had a meeting of delegates every 18 months. But it was invisible and hardly known. So, but the capacity was enormous. The capacity for, there was something that could break out of this reality. So for Lederach, moral imagination meant recognizing turning points and possibilities. To imagine constructive processes and to cultivate the art of leadership. And for Lederach, the leader is an artist. You're called to create as a leader. So in apostolic planning, you have to engage yourself as almost not only designing something new, but you're actually shaping and creating in a very artistic way something new with your companions. So these were, for me, key concepts. He talked about the web of relationships. So no matter where we're working or what change we're working at, for him, the key point was that we were in this web of mutual relating with lots of crossing points and knots. And he had a special way of looking at a web. He said whenever peace broke out in a society, and his experience was, it was where people connected at strategic points. So for me, in any kind of planning, I'm saying who needs to connect and what are the strategic points where they need to connect. So he said we need to engage in web watching and web weaving when we're planning. And that meant looking at the lines, the connections, the webs that are out there wherever you're working. Who's connected, but even who's not connected? Who should be connected? Who's missing from the web? You know, how to construct this web of relationships that will bring the fullness of life that we yearn for. And then where can these relationships be developed? And for him, a web was smart, flexible. It could move and change. So you might set up a group, but the group might morph into something else. So it wasn't something static. It was something moving and flexible and connecting and changing according to the changing context. So he said web watch and web weave. I know I've spent my last 9 years here in Rome web watching and web weaving, saying Who do we need to be connected to? Who do we need to get to know better? On behalf of religious life, on behalf of this organisation, where are the gaps? Where are the voices that are missing? Whose voice should be included? And here are some of his key concepts: the turning points, webs, yeast, platform, multiple, flexible. So for him, he imagined webs in every direction, and webs crisscrossing and meeting. So just to say a little bit of each, a turning point for Lederach was certain moments that can point people in a new direction. A crisis happens, or an opportunity opens up. A moment that's pregnant with new life, new life which even seems to arise from what seems barren ground. So I often think of congregations that are less, falling in numbers and kind of don't see possibilities and are closing ministries, and then all of a sudden see a new moment where something new can develop, maybe quite different, because they've been looking for turning points, looking for those small moments of opportunity. So where in apostolic planning, to ask oneself, are we recognizing the turning points, the small moments, even in what seems bleak, even where there doesn't seem to be much possibility? So new things for Lederach come to existence, and all things are reshaped, and our ways of seeing, hearing, feeling and thinking and so forth are transformed. That was for Lederach what the turning point was. So, for example, very small things often. When I began this role, I was told we had no places at the synod for the family, that they had asked at the synod office and had been told there were no official places for the International Union of Superiors General. So I couldn't conceive of a synod on the family that wouldn't have religious sisters present. So we went and knocked on doors, and we asked for an appointment with Cardinal Parolin, who could see it didn't make much sense to have sisters missing, and who arranged with the cardinal in charge at the time that we would have some formal representation at the synod. And we got 3 places, and the cardinal said to us, "You will send competent women." And we swallowed and said, "Yes, Your Eminence, we will send competent women." We sent an immigration lawyer. We sent a sister running an extraordinary centre for family welfare in Mexico, and we sent the president of the UISG. But what I'm saying is, from that small possibility, that turning point, we had 3 at the next synod, we had 20 at the Synod of Amazonia, and we now have 5 voting members who will be there ad aeternum, because UISG is now written into the new synod document. So USG, male religious and female religious, have to be consulted. So in a sense, from that small knocking on the door, over the course of the next number of years came change for women religious. So what I think I'm saying is, and it's a new way of thinking, Pope Francis has been a huge help, because he talks very positively about women religious, he looks and seeks to create spaces by appointments to commissions as consultors and so forth. And might I say, you as male religious and as men working in the church can do a huge amount to help create space for us as women. You can help create some of these turning points, whether it's in mission and ministry, in parish work or wherever, because it's together we have to form these relationships. So for me, I was looking at what have been the turning points for women religious, looking back over the last 10 years. I think in a way we have moved, not totally, but moved from the centre of things to the peripheries in choice of ministries, depending where you are. But certainly there has been a movement out to the peripheries. I have a story from India about my own congregation. We established a school very early on in Darjeeling, and a very good school and a very well-known school. And then at a particular stage, about 20 years ago, in reviewing and in planning for the future, they were talking with the local bishop, and he said, the problem with you Loretto sisters is you came to Darjeeling, you laid a golden egg, and then you sat on it.
Good.
And in a sense, there was a great wisdom in that. He said, now go to the peripheries. From Darjeeling, go out to the hills. And that's what they did. So in a sense, there's been a movement within religious life from centre to peripheries, from doing to being. You will hear much more reflection within female religious life on the quality of our being wherever we're doing something, rather than an overemphasis on doing. From strength to embracing vulnerability. From congregational mission and ministry, doing it alone, to doing it together. From a monocultural identity, and this has been a huge challenge in female religious life, from monocultural identity to becoming intercultural and flourishing. And we have put a huge amount of effort on training sisters in the whole area of becoming intercultural and culturally competent. And that's a challenge, I think, for all our religious communities. Even if we're from the same part of the world or the same country, we have a tremendous amount of variety. And from humble, hidden service, a certain understanding of humility, to knowing that humility now is to claim voice and visibility for the people on the margins. It's a different kind of being, of humbleness, of stepping out on behalf of those who are struggling. So are there any comments or reactions to Christina?
I want to resonate especially with the second one, because as early as, in fact, 23 years ago, one of my best consoling moments as a facilitator for the strategic apostolic planning of one religious congregation was when that congregation identified as their priority to deepen in their spirituality, because they were teachers of very prestigious schools, always busy teaching, being principals. Then they felt that they were hollowing out in terms of their charism and spirituality. So for their apostolic plan, the number one priority, instead of some mission somewhere, it was themselves to go back to the sources, to read their documents once again, to have monthly evenings where the community reads and reflects and tries to deepen in their own spirituality. So I resonate with that, yeah.
The other learning is that many religious congregations of sisters do not know their charism, have never identified their charism, particularly diocesan congregations. So they were founded by a bishop or a religious priest and are unaware of, in many parts of Africa particularly, they're only discovering and working on charism and trying to name it and go back to the sources of the founding. Because often they were really more founded as a workforce for the church rather than as a way of life. And there's a huge amount of work to be done. Do any of the others strike you or that apply to yourselves?
Thanks.
Just a comment from the Australian point of view. My experience is that in Australia, the religious women have come together and formed public juridic persons, the PJPs. And interesting, the Australian ministerial PJP organisation didn't have a seat at the synod table either, but does now, I think. But this was a way of shoring up charism and mission for facing the future.
Yeah.
The male religious orders are doing similar things.
Yeah.
Jesuits have chosen not to, of course. So, and there's some anger about that amongst some Jesuits in Australia that have expressed a frustration about the fact that they haven't accepted that they need to do something about this, or that they're still holding out. And they see the rise of PJPs as almost like a giving up. But the female religious orders are saying, well, it's not giving up. In fact, it's actually creating a whole new way of operating for the future.
Yeah, because these public juridic persons are a way in which religious and lay work together and eventually will pass into the hands of laity in some cases when there isn't the presence of religious sisters. So it's looking towards the future in how that kind of we can participate as religious and lay. And I'll speak a little bit about it. But these are the kind of turning points of looking at the reality, but seeing it as a possibility, not seeing it as a loss, but seeing it as an opportunity, for example, to develop new partnerships, new ways of working together, where there is real mutuality. And it's not always easy, and takes working at and takes working with lay people to really help them understand the charism of the particular religious orders. Places like Australia and the United States, Canada, have particularly looked at putting their, if you like, their corporate ministries into these, creating trusts or public juridic persons, because in a sense they see that they want to give them life and energy into the future, but with their lay religious collaboration. So it's a new way. Or sometimes it's a congregation mission, and it's become it's much more intercongregational in focus. And it does mean when you reach out to work with other congregations, there's a certain letting go, but there's also an enormous enrichment and equally a clarity about one's own congregational charism. I think one gets to kind of name that in a new way. So what kind of web weaving have we done at UIST? And again, I would say for when you're creating your web of pastoral planning, who's to be involved? So we're connecting with all those congregations worldwide, with the constellations, those groups, with the donors. And we have I think there's a whole group that we really need to share with and share our charism with, who want to be more involved often than just giving money or giving resources, but who expect a level and want a level of spiritual nourishment. We do a lot of work here in Rome with embassies to the Holy See, generally speaking about what sisters on the ground are experiencing in terms of informing governments from a more grassroots level what's happening. They'll hear from the Vatican dicasteries a certain level and from nuncios but I think those of us who are involved as religious and lay at grassroots level really have a responsibility to inform governments of the reality of what's happening in different parts of the world. We link with conferences of religious, with Vatican dicasteries, with individual religious and with other partners. So in a sense, they're the kind of webs of relationships that are always changing. And some very interesting ones. For example, 2 weeks ago, the military from the Netherlands came, who are doing a high training NATO course here in Rome, and came because they wanted to know what sisters on the ground who are in conflict situations, how they cope, and what that might teach them. So we had a most fruitful engagement. The FBI and the CIA came to visit. And you would say, why?
You worried, you are.
It was very interesting. They came because they have established with many governments a global service in terms of rescuing people who are kidnapped. And they came to tell us that religious people, men and women, are soft targets now in today's world. That in the past, because you were a sister, priest or brother or a lay missionary, that gave you a level of protection. Now they would say you have no level of protection. There is no respect for you as a religious person. Therefore, they were saying, have religious congregations develop the kind of protocols and procedures to form their members, and also on making decisions and discerning when to leave and when to stay. So it was a most helpful session. And we obviously deal with dicasteries on care of the earth, migration, anti-trafficking, and the big questions of today. So here's part of Lederach's wisdom. He says, if you want to bring about change, you have a small strategic group, what he called a yeast group, who together with others form a platform, which is a kind of a thinking, mediating group in order to bring about change. And that small yeast group needs to create multiple webs. I'll give you an example from my own life. So you have a small group of people who want to bring about change, or you develop your strategic plan and there's some area you're going to take action. So how do you take action? He would say you get a small group who are really committed to carrying that out, who will connect and build, if you like, platforms or other groups, and who will set out to influence the agenda or the society or bring about the task that has been committed to. My experience of that was I worked for the bishops in Ireland in the Justice and Peace Commission. We were 5 people. And I know we changed the prison system in Ireland. Why? Because we were that small strategic yeast group. We met with the parents of prisoners, we met with ex-prisoners, we met with the prison guards, the prison personnel, we met with prison governors, we met with prison chaplains, we met with government officials. But because we were committed to bringing about this change, we could strategically develop the platforms and the webs to change policy. So Ledrock would say it's not having millions of people on the street that brings about peace. It's small groups of committed people, often working together from different levels of society, who bring about the change. So the Yeast Group is the catalyst group. The right people involved in the right place at the right time, and they pull the organisation in a particular direction. So when you're looking at your universal apostolic priorities, who are the people you want in those yeast groups, in those groups planning? So the small group creates a platform with others. It could be with other organisations or individuals, builds a network of support networks, and works in a smart, flexible way. In other words, it's flexible enough to be able to change to the different realities. And in a way, that's what we've done at UISG. We've created these webs for change. So we have a small group working in anti-trafficking, a small group working for Catholic Care for Children International. I'll explain that in a moment. A small group sowing hope for the planet, which is Laudato Si. Again, another group focusing on international migration, and another group working with care and safeguarding delegates. They would be the kind of 5 priority areas that we have developed. So in Talitha Cum, there are now 60 networks worldwide working in 90 countries, involving sisters and lay people, and also priests and brothers, right? In Catholic Care for Children, that's an organisation that's focusing on moving congregations from institutional care for orphans to placing orphans back in families. Because 80% of children in orphanages are not orphans. They're poor children needing education and food. So there's a worldwide movement really only to have institutions where there's cases of gross need, and that they should be for the shortest possible time. Again, Sowing Hope for the Planet is a worldwide movement of sisters to action Laudato Si. Again, with the International Migration Network, it's calling sisters who are working on borders to work together in an international network. And the care and safeguarding delegates is there are now hundreds of delegates from individual congregations who are looking after care and safeguarding of minors and adults in vulnerable contexts. So in a sense, each of these has there's a small group that's really driving a worldwide network. And yes, it can be patchy, it can have great success or less success, but it certainly is impacting both individual congregations and often conferences of religious and others. And then the other area that has religious at UISG is we've set up 2 collaborative initiatives. One in South Sudan, which is called Solidarity with South Sudan, and the other is the Migrants Project in Sicily. These are our 2 intercongregational projects. In South Sudan, they're running schools, training teachers, nurses, midwives, farmers, pastoral workers. In Sicily, we're literally welcoming migrants. The Sicily project is now located in Lampedusa, so they're down at the port, really receiving the migrants who arrive. So, in a sense, that's part of this, both networks for change and then collaborative initiatives, and then intercongregational collaboration. And maybe this is part of, a an aspect that is becoming more and more when you look across the 1,900 congregations, looking to create a sense of a global sisterhood where we can help one another. So, you know, that congregations know that they have partners, the members of UISG. So the help can be the financial support, both during COVID and post-COVID. Many religious congregations, small religious congregations, were suffering because their ministry closed. They had no money for their own upkeep. So there has been financial support. We've been supporting in Ukraine the Ukrainian migrants who are living in about 9 countries in Europe, and in other areas of conflict we've been able to give support, and we've been supporting small struggling congregations. So you're looking at also formation on site and here in Rome, but also online. During COVID, I think we had 80,000 participants online. And then creating a foundation together for the support of elderly sisters worldwide and representing congregations of women religious at the Vatican. So in a sense, what I'm trying to show you is that when you go back to Lederach's kind of, he's saying if we can identify moments of opportunity, often in difficult times, if we can create webs to connect ourselves and to connect with those who can help us, if we can identify these small groups who are committed to building platforms and building webs, and if we can be flexible, we can reach out to the needs that are there. So in a sense, that's showing you at a global level what we are trying to do at a time when probably women's religious life would have experienced itself as being in decline. And yet I think sees itself as having a hope for all sorts of new possibilities. In looking at some of those turning points, I'm looking at, say, several congregations in the United States who have grouped together. There's a kind of a Milwaukee group where the sisters have decided that they can't keep supplying administrative offices and building the kind of support structure that you need in a congregation. They say, well, we'll do it for 4, 5 or 6 congregations together in order to free up people for mission and ministry. So in a sense, the aim of this is to say, how can we be more fruitful? How can we read the signs of the times? How can we collaborate? And how can we be flexible? So I don't know if anybody wants to come back and comment on some of those before we go into the end.
Thank you for sharing what you are trying to do here,
Sure.
which is very impressive. Is there any plan to take it to other places? Like we have got CRI at the national level in India,
Yeah.
where, as you said, 12% of the women religious are involved. Can this be sort of shared with them
Yeah.
so that they are also able to introduce such things?
Yeah.
That is one area which I think 4 or 5 of us a year we will be interested. Second thing is, you talked about having a contact with the dicasteries. Can something be done, at least in our context? The way the sisters have relationship or collaboration with the dioceses. That is one of the very weak situation, at least in India. When I was provincial, I was the president of CRI. We tried to work out a contract or agreement with the Bishops' Conference and Tamil Nadu CRI in South. We have signed it also. Agreement was signed. Even then, there is no guarantee that the bishops will respect that. That is different matter. At least some agreement has been made regarding property, ownership, giving a certain contribution to the diocese, all those things are there.
Yeah.
I feel that is also important when such a huge number of sisters are there. They don't have that ability to really function in the way they could function. That is one of the concerns we have. Secondly, they don't have the courage also to stand up
Okay.
and sort of claim their rightful place in the. They're all, the last point you made at the beginning, they are voiceless, but almost like servants. They are going on like this. That situation needs to be changed. I'm very happy about what you are sharing here. Something similar has to happen, at least in a country where there is a huge number of religious who are highly potentially, they can do wonderful service. Much, much better than what they are doing now. And I just wanted to comment on that.
No, and I appreciate your comments greatly, because I think you're quite right. We're trying to model something that you're hoping will be taken up at the grassroots level. So we would do a lot of conversation with Sister Nirmalini now, who's the president of the Conference of Religious in India, and who's a brave woman too in her own. But we're very aware, for example, the anti-trafficking, for example, network is extremely strong in India. I'll use India as an example. Yeah, because I think it's a very good example. However, when you come to the whole area of institutional and residential care, it's very weak. There's so many hostels and orphanages that are probably not very well regulated. And they know they have to do something about that, and that there's a need. But the needs are so great in terms of meeting the needs of children. So it's a huge challenge. The congregations are beginning to participate in the global network on care and safeguarding, and beginning to say to themselves, what's that calling for us to do? A lot is happening in the area of Laudato Si. But when you get to the individual religious life and the relationship with bishops, it is very, very difficult in parts of the world. And we are not slow in pointing that out here in the various dicasteries. We say it very clearly. There's a very interesting report that was done in India called It's High Time. And it's a group of superiors general who were very courageous, because they invited many to participate, but only a small group had the courage to do so. And they, leaving aside sexual abuse, which is a whole other area which will need to be attended to, they looked at the area of other kinds of abuse of authority in terms of property, non-payment of any kind of salary or recognition, also, in a sense, sometimes being condemned from the pulpit for saying or doing something. So they highlighted a number really of very painful situations, and we brought that report to the dicastery. The problem we have, I think, in the church is dealing with both the charismatic and the hierarchical church, and developing those relationships together, relationships that are mutual, where we can say things in love and truth. For me, one of the graces of the Synod was we could be honest at the table, and particularly when we got to the section on women in the church and on religious women, because sometimes we're not even seen as women. We're almost seen as some other category. Laity see us as almost clerical. Clerics don't see us really as laity. And sometimes I say, well, are we kind of a third, whatever, in the middle? It's very challenging, really. And being within the church and yet wanting to work for change. I know that's what gives me energy to keep knocking at the doors and saying this must change. it was heard, I think, with some shock at the tables of the synod, how women in general feel treated, but then how religious sisters, certainly in parts of the world, have felt treated. But it does take creating the spaces. I often think maybe the decline in vocations actually is one of those turning points where you begin to ask questions, well, why might it be happening? And it's not just secularism and materialism. There might be other reasons why vocations, there are fewer vocations, certainly in parts of the world. But thank you for your comment. And can I just say, part of my role is to encourage the sisters to speak.
That's good.
And in a way, I say to them, I can speak on your behalf, but it's much more powerful when you speak on your own behalf.
One more point which you can consider from your setup is whether through the dicasteries, certain influence can be asserted on the bishops.
Sure.
It is more the diocesan problem. Religious priests and their treatment of sisters is slightly different. I wouldn't say it is perfect, but it's slightly different.
Yeah.
The diocesan way of dealing with them is very, very unsatisfactory.
Yeah.
Whether something can go through the nuncio, through this one, something has to be done.
Yeah. And things are beginning to happen, but it's slow. And it's like all change. You sometimes you take the long view and you say the building of the relationships in order to get the people to listen who need to listen can sometimes take time. And you have to have the climate where what you're saying is likely to be listened to. But we will continue to do that. Thank you for your encouragement.
Well, thank you, Pat. I'm struck at your gentle, provocative way of introducing transformation and how to engage in the process. And I'm struck by both how Yolanda and yourself have invited us to tune into our own humanity, our vulnerabilities, our weaknesses. I'm part of a congregation that is on the journey to completion. All I can say is when we face our death, that is the beginning of hope for new life. It's the paradox. We heard it yesterday. It is through the passion we will arrive at resurrection. There is something really profound in what we're hearing today. And it's a personal call as well as a collective call. It's not about others. It starts here in the room, in our own hearts. Thank you.
And that problem is when we're big and strong, we're often, I know it in my own life, my own congregation, we're often much slower to recognise our cracks, so as to speak, and less open to the possibilities of what I would say is real collaboration at depth, not superficial collaboration. One of my challenges to myself would be, in my own organisation, is am I really allowing everybody in here to feel they have voice, visibility and agency in bringing about change? And that we're not playing at change. Because I've seen that happening in both religious life and diocese, where there's an exercise going on, but really things are being decided or have been decided somewhere else. And a certain disillusionment, or they've been part decided somewhere else, or the whole isn't brought to the table. In my own province in Ireland, we've had a particular journey that has been a very painful journey about our schools, because a decision was made rather hastily and with, I would say, poor consultation. We have a trust, and a decision was made that we would merge with another trust. And there was uproar. And we've had 2 years of uproar. In a sense, at the beginning, an attempt was made to justify the decision. And until the point was reached where somebody could say, we made a mistake, we did this very badly, we could begin the process all over again and begin a road to healing. Now, I actually think, even though it's been very painful, very deep bonds of communion are being forged in and through the painful journey we've undergone. It's a bit what you're saying when you name it and own it. And maybe sometimes we don't do. I was going to ask Christina, you in your own reflection in the book, you're saying there's a time to plan or not to plan. And sometimes we shy away from planning when things are difficult. We say, well, this isn't the time we should begin this. We're in a bit of chaos, our relationships aren't good. And maybe it's the very time we should begin, but with the kind of a humility and an openness to acknowledge things aren't going well. I don't know what was in your mind when you wrote that section.
It really depends on how bad relationships are. They're never perfect. And you're right in that the journey of communal discernment and apostolic planning is that time when you try to heal, have some kind of healing in that bond with each other. In that section in the book, what I was talking about is when people are not ready for even to embark on that journey, and there's a bit of catharsis that needs to be done first. So in those situations, maybe wait a year or so with a lot of listening by the leaders until people are ready to even risk talking about it with each other. Yeah.
Any other comment or? Yes. So maybe I'll just share my own last learnings. For me, my learning has been this: vulnerability is grace to openness. That when we can name that, and smaller is often beautiful, leading to being more nimble and flexible, being more participative and discerning, more present, more relational, more open to networking, and discovering the mystical, prophetic nature of consecrated life. And I think I have in my mind, I think I became very aware during the time of the tsunami in Indonesia of hearing of congregations who were actually very small, being able literally to send their people to help. It didn't take a great big discernment. There was a kind of an ability to be more nimble and flexible. I think vulnerability also can call us to invite more participants, to look for the relationships we need to develop, and look for the voices that need to be part of the discerning. I think vulnerability calls us to be more present to ourselves, to really know what's happening in that interior journey that we're being invited on in terms of change and transformation, because it's only the internal has to match the external change. More relational, in my own leadership, I've found not only is the relational important, but it's also the trusting of the group to carry the process forward. And I think part of it has been the learning to stand aside. You know, Christina talks about you choose who's going to lead the apostolic planning. In the past, I would have put myself into the apostolic planning team. Now I take myself out of it, because I think it creates much more space for people to really think and dream. And I think it also deepens the relationality and the trust involved. More networking and rediscovering the mystical prophetic nature of consecrated life. And so, in a sense, the invitation to all of us is to enter that much deeper part of ourselves, our relationship with God, with self, with God, with others, with the cosmos, and also the awareness of what this charism of religious life can bring to the church and the world. And just looking at John Paul Lederach's vocation of risk, he says it's a vocation that involves a mysterious journey, because any kind of planning is a risk.
Yeah.
But he says, listen to the inner voice. Explore uncharted waters. Where are we called to? Where's the new that we're called to? Embrace vulnerability and let go of the need to control. That's my message to myself. And I think as religious, sometimes we don't find it easy to let go and let others. And I think part of what we can do is we can create that space where others can function well. And I'm just going to end with Mary Oliver, because I love her poetry. And I don't know about you, but I feel the need to keep nourishing myself with, obviously, the Word of God, but also the nourishing words of others in poetry or song, or however it is you are nourished. As someone on this journey. So her poem, The Journey, which you may or may not know, she said, it was already late. It was already late enough, and a wild night, and the road full of fallen branches and stones. But little by little, as you left their voices behind, the stars began to burn through the sheets of clouds. And there was a new voice, which you slowly recognized as your own, that kept you company as you strode deeper and deeper into the world, determined to do the only thing you could do, determined to save the only life you could save. I might change the words of that. And I might say, you kept company as you strode deeper and deeper into the world, determined to be the only thing you could be, determined to save the only life you could save. So in a sense, it's bringing the doing and being together But I think above all, my learning for the process of transformation has been to get in touch with the self, the being, in order that the doing might be enriched. And maybe that's where life to the full resides. So there are my few words, and just thank you for coming, and I hope maybe some of the ideas may have helped you, sparked something, or that you can apply to your own situation. Thank you. Thanks very much.